Hi, I'm George Hodgin, the founder and CEO of Biopharmaceutical Research Company, BRC. You're listening to Professionally Cannabis.
Where do they go, the smoke rings I blow each night? Oh, what...
Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Professionally Cannabis. In these times of a biblical level plague threatening the land, economic upsets that might lead to civilizational collapse, Johnny, what do we have in store for our listeners today?
Well, for today's episode, we're joined by George Hodgin, who's the founder and CEO of the Biopharmaceutical Research Company, dealer to the US government, friend of the pod, and he will supply federally compliant cannabis in this administration or the next.
Gladiators, I salute you. And by that I mean, listeners, enjoy the show.
Where do they go, the smoke rings
Ladies and
I
gentlemen,
blow
I'd like to
each
welcome today's
night?
guest, the founder and CEO of the BRC, Biopharmaceutical Research Company, George Hodgin. Now, George has been working on the federally legal side of cannabis in America, not something we hear too much about. Welcome to the show, George.
My pleasure to be here.
So, George, as you'll know, our customary question to all of our guests on Professionally Cannabis is, what led you to the plant?
I was a Navy SEAL officer in the United States. I was serving in combat for about 7 years in Afghanistan and elsewhere around the world. And as you all are very accustomed to and have pointed out on the show, military veterans that have served overseas in combat zones report using cannabis and that it has therapeutic effects to treat a lot of their wartime visible and invisible wounds. And a dear friend of mine was going through a very hard time with some of his wartime wound treatments, and he started to explore medical cannabis as a potential treatment. And the US, the Department of VA, which is Veterans Affairs in the United States, effectively told him, look, we hear that it's good, we think it's good, we're not sure that it's good, but there's not really much research being done on it. And most of what you see in the United States is observational or anecdotal. I absolutely got appalled and then obsessed with the fact that in the United States, 200 million consumers can access the plant unless they're a scientist or a doctor, and the scientist or doctor cannot for medical research. And so I decided to learn more about this issue in the US and come to find out that the federal government recognized what I did, which is that there's a growing gap between consumer knowledge and consumer acceptance of cannabis and the cannabis plant and what scientific researchers are able to find out and maximize the good that the plant can do. So I started BRC to try and fill in the gap between what's happening at the consumer level and what's happening with the scientific research level by producing federally compliant cannabis for scientific researchers approved by the US federal government.
And so for our listeners, who actually many of whom will be US based and probably know more about this than we do, how much federally compliant cannabis is there in the US compared to state compliance, compared to the black market? What's the pie chart look like?
The pie chart is very, very small towards the federal cannabis landscape. So here in the United States, as a consumer or individual, you could go to a dispensary, assuming you're in a legal state, and you could purchase any litany of products, if it's a vape, an edible, whatever. If you're a doctor or scientist, meaning you're regulated by the federal law, not the state law, if you're regulated by the federal law, then you have to procure your cannabis for any sort of research you want to do from a small US government farm in Mississippi that has been the only producer of compliant cannabis for federal researchers in the United States for over 60 years. It's been widely reported that that farm doesn't do the job that scientists want it to do. In other words, that the products aren't as diverse as consumers have access to at the state level or even the black market level. And so what we're attempting to do, and what we are going to do, is bring a variety of cannabis products and cannabis genetics through the federally compliant system and give scientists and doctors access to them so that they can figure out exactly what's helping the most people and why.
How does this relationship work? Are there researchers and institutions that are coming to you and saying, look, we know that people want this, but we can't get it. Can you help us? Or are you approaching research institutions and saying, hey, I know it's Schedule 1, but we've got the secret sauce to get federal cannabis into your lab? How is the mechanics of it looking like?
A little bit of both. I think what I have been really pleasantly surprised with is The United States education or healthcare system as well, you have all these incredible minds and incredible universities. And most of the experts feel like they are sitting on the sidelines of a great public health, either crisis when it comes to something like vaping in the United States, or a public health revolution when it comes to the benefits that cannabis is bringing patients. And they're all watching from the sidelines, and consumers are going sort of through this great public health experiment that otherwise should be run and should be managed through a healthcare system or a doctor or scientist. So consumer goes to the dispensary, but I effectively want to be the dealer for the Schedule 1 researchers in the United States. So what does that actually look like? I think it's interesting to think about, certainly for an international audience. If you want to be a Schedule 1 researcher in the United States, then you have to get a permit from our narcotics agency, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA. That process is miserably opaque and complex and can take a very long time. And I'll just give you an example. In our building that we built, we're several hundred yards or miles away from a state legal, federally illegal dispensary, meaning if someone wanted access to cannabis, they would simply just go to the dispensary. They wouldn't need to come to our building. And we were asked the question during a DEA inspection, is this vault that you've constructed to house finished cannabis products eventually to be distributed to researchers, can it withstand a direct hit from an 18-wheeler semi-truck in the event that someone wanted to steal the cannabis out of here? And my colleagues and I sort of looked at each other and thought, what century are you people living in? Why would you rent an 18-wheeler and drive it into our building when you could simply walk down the street and buy the cannabis you wanted legally for $5 a gram in California? And that discrepancy really illuminates what goes on at the federal level or with the federal regime in the United States and what consumers face at the state level. But the doctor or the scientist can't do that. They can't do the situation, what I described to you. They cannot go to a dispensary. So they have no access to vapes. They have no access to edibles or tinctures. They have access to dried flower material that's been grown in the same outdoor conditions since 1960 at the small farm in Mississippi.
And so you touched upon the international market there. And I know that you've had some success with importing products legally from the international market into the US. Can you give us a bit of color around that?
In the US, let's go back to the example of I'm a Schedule 1 researcher. So if I'm a Schedule 1 researcher and I'm making this university up, but let's say I'm at Stanford University, my alma mater, and I say, I want to give a small amount of cannabis to a mouse just to study what happens in the mouse. That researcher has to move the moon, more or less, through a complex bureaucracy and regulatory system simply to access a tiny amount of cannabis to feed to the rat just to see what happens.
Even if they're operating in one of the states where medical use is permitted?
Absolutely right, because the scientist and doctor, they are regulated, and universities in the United States are regulated and beholden to federal law, not state law. So the state controlled substance laws or the state drug laws, cannabis laws, are entirely irrelevant and effectively non-existent when you're dealing with the federal government. So they couldn't care less that my business, BRC, that we operate in California, or that one of these universities in California wants access to cannabis. It doesn't even cross their radar. So they would say, okay, great, Mr. and Mrs. Scientist, you have to access cannabis. You have to get a small amount from this farm in Mississippi. And that scientist is probably going to say, my God, it's going to take a year of red tape. And I've got to do things like I have to demonstrate to the federal government that the 5 grams of cannabis that I'm going to feed to this rat in the basement of my laboratory, that I store it in a 750-pound vault that's chained to the floor. I'm not exaggerating. That's what has to, with a camera on it. And meanwhile, obviously, that scientist probably lives within 100 yards or 10 miles of a dispensary that's selling every type of cannabis product under the sun. But that doesn't matter. And so what these scientists are saying is, look, we go through this miserable, complex bureaucracy, and then we get a product that's of no use to us. It's been grown outside under the sun in Mississippi. It's the same genetics they've used since 1960. Why even go through the process? And so what happens is that the science doesn't advance in the United States and the research doesn't advance. So one solution we've come up with is to go through a really rigorous and complex import process. We've recently been the first high THC cannabis flower legally under a DEA import permit from the European Union, we think in history, into the United States. So we went out and sourced high THC product and worked with some partners in the Netherlands and deliver the product here to our lab legally. We can do that.
Was that from Bedrocan?
The import came through OMC, Office of Medical Cannabis, but it is a Bedrocan product.
And moving forward, where do you see most likely for you to be sourcing genetics to bring in under the federal regime for research? And presumably anything that's coming into the country is going to need to be GMP, but are there any other standards that the product's going to need to be adhering to?
Ultimately, our goal is to grow the cannabis and produce the cannabis here. So I do not want to go through the process to import it. But if our promise to scientists that we're working with is that we will get you clean, consistent cannabis with which to do meaningful research, then right now we have to go outside of the United States. I wish we weren't having to do that as much as I love our European friend. Well, I was going to say European Union friends, but I suppose that's not you anymore.
Let's not even start on that one.
Sorry. That's a podcast.
That's another podcast.
And a couple pints.
Exactly.
So our friends in Europe, either formerly known as EU members or current EU members, as much as we enjoy working with international companies, as an American business, I think we should be producing these products here in America. But if we can't, if the federal government continues to sort of slow the process of allowing us to produce cannabis for researchers, then we'll look outside the U.S. to places like Canada, Israel. We've just brought in the first high THC cannabis flower from Latin America. Legally, we brought it in from Uruguay. And to your question about GMP certifications, the real thing from a regulatory perspective is that it has to have been produced legally and exported legally. So we could go to Canada and they could produce something legally and then export it to us here. If we're simply going to do chemical analysis, R&D, tinkering in a lab or giving it to an animal, then it doesn't have to have been produced GMP like you would see coming into Europe. However, if it's going to go into a person, into a clinical trial, then yeah, it's got to meet all the GMP and FDA requirements, which is a whole nother ballgame.
And presumably being the dealer or the future dealer to the federal researchers in the States, like probably all dealers, I imagine you're coming up against some sort of opposition. Can you walk us through a little bit of the challenges, perhaps call them war stories that you've been experiencing? And in addition to that, what are the future hurdles you think you're going to have to leap over?
Well, I prefer the term supplier to dealer, but I've been called many worse things by many people. So in this case, I would take dealer to government scientists as a badge of honor. We do envision ourselves being the dealer for federal scientists and for pharmaceutical, biotech, and cannabis researchers that otherwise can't have access to a product. In terms of war stories, it's like, man, how much time do we have and where should I even start? What we've found is an incredible amount of institutional inertia and bureaucracy that is so deep with the federal government that it's hard to even know where to start. I shared the example with you of having to construct a storage and security vault to house the finished products of cannabis that we'll have. And the first question we were asked was, can this be hit by a semi rig, an 18-wheeler, so that someone doesn't break into it? Another question we got asked was, how thick is the concrete under this massive custom-built $100,000 vault? How do you know someone's not going to tunnel up through here? I mean, it's like
Ocean's 11 style.
Exactly. It's like Ocean's 11. And I thought to myself, if somebody tunnels in here, they're going to be really, really disappointed. They're going to find a bunch of cannabis flower and no cash, and they probably just should have robbed the dispensary down the street.
Although you're not advocating that.
I'm not advocating that. Certainly not advocating that. There's an outstanding police force where we are, so you'd come up against great opposition. No, I'm not advocating that by any means.
That actually brings me on to talking about your team, because what I saw in the range of people there, you had some storied people from the police force, or at least other veterans such as yourself. Could you tell us a little bit more about the people who make up the BRC?
Yes, I am incredibly proud and humbled by our team. We are a merry band of brothers and sisters that consider ourselves freedom fighters working towards compliant cannabis in the United States, which is not a task or challenge for the faint of heart. The amount of focus that it takes to come to work every day and just be kicked in the you-know-what and slapped in the face by federal government regulations, for the team to keep showing up and keep working on behalf of patients speaks to their drive. We have one gentleman who served for 30 years as an anti-narcotic, anti-gang task force SWAT team leader. We have another gentleman who has worked in drug development and pharmaceuticals his whole life. And prior to that life, was a medic in the United States Army. Another woman who's incredible, who's the daughter of a Vietnam veteran. And the theme, the glue that holds us all together is that all of us sort of look around and go, wow, you cannot tell me with a straight face that the US federal government shouldn't be researching cannabis. It will potentially drive down healthcare costs. It could help with the opioid crisis. All of us in some way have been impacted by someone who's fallen victim to the opioid crisis. And to think that cannabis could potentially serve as an alternative treatment for their pain makes people absolutely furious that we're coming up against these hurdles that the federal government poses. Another gentleman who is a grower of cannabis in Canada, in the legal market in Canada, and we've brought him into the team to help advise us on how Health Canada looks at some of these things, because they do it from a federal perspective. Well, another hurdle we've come up against that the team has really, really persevered through is you have a patchwork of laws that were written by people who have no idea what the cannabis plant is, how it's produced, or how it should be moved or stored, etc. I mean, it's almost as if you took a bunch of bureaucrats and lawyers and locked them in a basement and said, okay, everyone, you have a weekend to write cannabis laws. And I know you've never seen or touched cannabis. We'll see you on Monday. And that's more or less what happened. Like, that seems like the amount of intentionality that went into the patchwork of laws in the United States. And we run into that every day. You know, in California, they say, well, it's illegal to sell someone cannabis or provide cannabis to someone who's not licensed by the state of California. And the federal government says it is illegal to sell cannabis to someone who is not licensed by the federal government and participates in the state market. And those two things are obviously mutually exclusive. So there's two sets of laws, and you must ask yourself, well, you know, do I listen to my mother or my father? Which one do I want to yell at me the least? And that's how you have to operate in this world.
And how do others in the industry who are working to the state regulations rather than federal ones, how do they interact with you or see your business?
We don't interact with them, to put it bluntly. We have an incredible amount of respect for a lot of the giants whose shoulders we're standing on right now, who have been advocates and worked their tails off for decades to advance the discussion around cannabis in the United States, to where we're even having this dialogue with the federal government. But the fact is, the DEA and the federal government have been absolutely explicit in saying, if you want to participate in the United States federal market, you cannot engage in the medical or recreational markets in the state. We still view that as a federal crime. So even though we're here in California, we don't participate. So from a business perspective, as you all can imagine, and as some of your guests point out around sort of the challenges of operating a business in the cannabis space with respect to banking and insurance, et cetera, we don't have any of those challenges because we don't break federal law. So we have access to banking, we have access to loans and insurance, et cetera.
So how did you finance the startup actually? Was this privately invested funds?
Yeah, I was going to say what we don't have access to is short-term cash flows, which, you know, is not unique to the cannabis industry. You know, it's not unique to our business in the cannabis industry. But we're sort of sitting here on the sidelines going, federal government, look around you, like pull your head out of the sand, you know, you pull your head out of somewhere, but since we're on a podcast, I'll say pull it out of the sand.
Oh no, we're British. We're fully au fait with swearing. It's different rules here.
But I think he's talking about the federal government. That's probably a better reason to taper.
Remember, you're talking to a sailor, a Navy sailor, so be careful encouraging my swear words. Otherwise, your podcast may be banned. So, you know, we're sitting here in California and we're like, federal government, pull your head out of your ass. People are selling cannabis products and making money hand over fist. And we are trying to operate in full compliance with federal law, much to our short-term business sacrifice. We are not selling into those markets, even though we probably could, because we want to be squeaky clean for the federal regulators. And to your question about how did we finance it, we've taken investment from several high net worth individuals and angel investors who want to see cannabis research being done because they, one, are big supporters of veterans. In the United States, 1/3, so 33% of veterans who fought in Iraq or Afghanistan, they report that they use cannabis to treat their PTSD and chronic pain. That's an incredible number. 92% of vets in the United States say that they wish the US government would actively research cannabis. As you all probably know from the UK, there is one group in the United States that still can be seen as bipartisan or apolitical, and it's veterans in the US right now. Despite the fact that our federal government is an absolute dumpster fire when it comes to the state of our politics and the state of our country, veterans are still seen as sort of a neutral arbiter. And the fact that 90% of us would say, for the love of God, federal government, please just help and research cannabis. If it's bad, then we should know that because we're taking it anyways. And if it's good, let's figure out exactly how to make it good for the most amount of people through proper research and dosing and formulations. And our investors understand that, and they're big supporters of veterans and veteran healthcare. And so they've decided to take a bet on us.
Now, it's been mooted that sort of in the US, it may well take another couple of election cycles to really bring the federal conversation to the table and actually make a change with regards to how cannabis is scheduled. What are your views on that? Would love to hear your 2 cents.
I think there's an oversimplification of the federal cannabis policy landscape that runs rampant through the cannabis industry and in the United States in general. There's just this view, and you all hear it, I know, and guests have brought it up all the time, where they say, oh, it's inevitable, cannabis will be legalized. And sort of everyone drums on and ho-hum, that sounds great. No one actually knows what that means. Like in the United States, it could be decriminalized, which I think is likely, which effectively means as a consumer, you'd be given, a drinking ticket or a speeding ticket, but you shouldn't be thrown in jail for cannabis usage and possession. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that it's completely descheduled, where it's removed from the controlled substance list, either through legislation, through our Congress, or through some sort of action by the president and the attorney general. I think that's actually a lot harder road to hoe than most folks think. And I wouldn't be hanging my hat on the effectiveness of the US Congress right now.
If I can pull you up on that, actually, would you be able to run us through the broad implications for the cannabis industry of both scenarios? One being decriminalization, the other being descheduling.
Absolutely. I think, and if I may, I'll also throw the third option or the third potential avenue in there, which would be rescheduling, which is where through an administrative process, the federal government says, okay, you're right, advocates in cannabis industry, cannabis is not worse than cocaine and as dangerous as heroin. We'll reschedule it to a Schedule 2 or Schedule 3. So what do all those things mean? I think, frankly, Oscar and Johnny, that there is going to be a massive hangover in the cannabis space where people said, oh boy, we should have been careful what we wished for. And what I mean by that is if cannabis is descheduled, then the value of having a cannabis production license in whatever state, if it's California or Michigan or whatever, the value of that license very quickly evaporates because then you just have a large business like any other, and then it becomes big tobacco or big alcohol, where you have to have massive interstate distribution, massive scale, massive production, and the regulatory barriers to entry that are enjoyed right now by the cannabis industry for having, a pretty rigorous licensing process and limited number of licenses, that more or less goes away. And then you say, okay, now we're producing tomatoes or tobacco, and then we can sell it in a 7-Eleven or an alcohol store. And I think the dispensary owners aren't going to like it. The cultivators that aren't cultivating on a massive scale aren't going to like it. And certainly, the consumer may enjoy it, but I think that you will see sort of a mass adoption or I hope it doesn't happen, but a failure of a lot of these businesses that didn't plan for nationwide adoption. And then on the rescheduling part, if cannabis becomes Schedule 2 or Schedule 3, not much changes from the individual consumer or the cannabis industry. But I think the pharmaceutical world, sort of big pharma that most cannabis folks tend to shy away from or hate, frankly.
Yeah, I'd say it's an antagonistic relationship.
And it's an antagonist relationship. And as soon as cannabis becomes Schedule 2 or Schedule 3, which I think is a real possibility, then that further opens the door to traditional pharmaceutical drug development. And I don't think the cannabis industry, as you pointed out, want that.
For my money, they'd possibly like the results of it, but having seen what single molecule action, clinical trials, and other common standards for medical advances being applied to cannabis, and cannabis, because of its having hundreds of constituent parts and because of its variability, not meeting those hurdles and failing to be involved in the classical medical system, has sort of made many of those industry members antagonistic. So I'll obviously hold them in my heart, but I do think understanding exactly the mechanisms of action within the body for cannabinoid medicine is going to be what takes us to the very interesting, specific, targeted medicines. So perhaps on that point, we've talked about your company facilitating researchers by bringing product to them. Do you have plans for research of your own within your company, and what kind of areas interest you?
We do. Selfishly, I am very interested in causes and research indications that are near and dear to the veteran community. And that goes back to sort of what your question, which is what brought you to the plant. And what brought me to the plant is veterans seeking alternative healthcare options for PTSD and chronic pain. And so those are the things that we want to support and invest in and research ourselves. I think you would be hard pressed to find a lawmaker or scientist that said, my God, we've sent these people off to war, and then when they come home, shouldn't we be looking for every single option to treat any wounds that they have? And so we actively want to be involved in that, and will be involved in that. We've got several university partnerships we're really excited about. One is with the University of California at Davis, where we have a plant science research partnership with them right now, wherein they're studying a lot of the basic chemistry and biology of the actual cannabis plant. A lot of the science that's been done for every other plant out there, but because scientists have been locked out of studying the cannabis plant, a lot of the foundational science is still in its earliest days. And so we're working really closely with University of California, Davis, one of the top plant science programs in the world, to unlock a lot of the questions and unlock a lot of the potential of the cannabis plant.
And in the spirit of digression that we've come across in today's episode, not sure why, maybe it's recording on a Friday, there's other scheduled drugs which have more of a reputation in being abused than being used for medicine that have been shown somewhat successful in trials in humans for PTSD. So I'm thinking here specifically of MDMA, but I also believe certain psilocybin usage have been found. Is the BRC interested in the broad, let's call it, transferring these quite old drugs in many cases from the black market and from being known for their abuse to opening up new ways of treating our most vulnerable people?
Yes, we are interested. Our mission statement is to advance science and research and drug development of any plant-based therapeutic. Psilocybin is one that is certainly of interest. In the short term, however, we are focused on cannabis and cannabis exclusively.
The opportunity is just too huge
to
grasp all of it and something. I see
yeah.
that.
And what's interesting is with one of the permits we have now from the Drug Enforcement Administration, and certainly what we intend to do in the future, we can say things like MDMA, psilocybin, heroin, cocaine, and we can be actively involved in the production and research and distribution of those products. And nobody bats an eye from a regulatory perspective. It rolls off the tip of our tongues and they hear it and they say, yep, you're authorized to do that. The second that you say cannabis or marijuana, they sort of throw their hands up aghast and step back and say, oh, no, marijuana is different. And we say, what do you mean? How so? Why is it different? Oh, well, it's got a long history here in the United States and it's really politically charged. So we'd prefer if you don't engage with us, and instead we'd like you to engage with some of the bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. I hope that as many patients and veterans can be helped as possible by any sort of breakthrough therapy, if it's MDMA or psilocybin. But it seems to me that the federal government's really missing an opportunity with cannabis by having such a head up their ass approach to it right now.
And George, well, it sounds like you definitely are somewhat of an industry maverick. Outside of those in the BRC, who are your other industry friendlies who are helping you get where you want to go?
A maverick is something I've never been called, so that's good. I think our team is really, really fired up. When we started the business 2.5 years ago, I had no idea the time and the challenge that this would take. And now, it went from being sort of inspired, aspirational entrepreneur to now we're in this fight and we feel this thing personally that so many other advocates have felt for decades. And we're fired up and we're not going anywhere. We're going to win this fight. We will be producing federally legal cannabis in the United States, and we are putting all the pieces together to do it. Your question of sort of who are the friendlies is a really interesting one. We haven't found or interacted with anyone else in the United States that sort of plays cleanly, so to speak. A lot of other people that are in the, or purported to be in the cannabis research game, are sort of saying one thing and then interacting with the state markets, the medical and recreational markets on the other hand, or sort of out the back door. And we found that our squeaky clean position is a lonely one, but that's okay.
I see similarities between your business in the US and startups within cannabis within Europe, in that there's a huge load of anecdotal black market or suggestive evidence to say why these businesses should be here. But then when you're just starting up, there's actually no real simple way to do it and provide patient access in a way that the state gets behind. It feels like politicians playing catch up here and sort of doing what's the least damage to their reputation rather than advancing what's in the interests of their citizenry.
It's a brilliant observation, because I think what we've seen in the US and what you all are going through in Europe and in the UK is that 2 or 3 years ago, cannabis could be a fringe topic for a politician. They could just say, look, it's not on my focus, it's not on my radar, I don't really have a response. That's not the case around the world. Every politician has to have an opinion on cannabis now, because of the advocates that have been on the show and the visionaries that have been on the podcast before have done such a good job of elevating cannabis to an international discussion. And so now what the politicians say is, yes, we'll work on it. We've legalized cannabis, but we'll get back to you with the framework in a year or two. And what they don't understand is that there are people out there whose lives are on the line. There are suffering children with epilepsy. I cannot imagine what it must be like to be a parent with a suffering child or a suffering spouse or loved one, and to hear a politician through one side of their mouth say, we support cannabis and cannabis research, and then they fail to actually enact any of the regulatory frameworks in Europe that enable it. It's incredibly frustrating and duplicative, I think, the way they treat it.
Yeah, the parents who feel betrayed by politicians that they've spoken to in person, I think I've come across that, certainly in the UK, certainly in Denmark, and it's probably not an uncommon story elsewhere. Where I was leading with the internationalism of it is, does any sort of international presence play into your long-term aspirations for the BRC? Could we see your products here in Europe, potentially? Certainly the outputs of your research, one would hope.
I would hope so. There is a regulatory pathway for us to produce drugs here in the United States, cannabis drugs or cannabis-derived drugs, and export them anywhere in the world where it's compliant. So into the EU, into the UK. That is in the long-term plan and strategy. But in the short term, sort of what keeps me up at night is holding the federal government's feet to the fire to let us produce the cannabis for simple research, not even putting the cart before the horse and say we will find a therapeutic effect. Literally, let's just do the research now. That's what keeps me up at night. And certainly I hope and think that the research will lead to commercially available drugs that we could send into the EU and the United Kingdom. I think, if I may, back to your earlier question about sort of friendlies in the industry, there are some really, really international companies that are visionaries out there. I just haven't seen any of them in the United States. Folks like Bedrocan in the Netherlands, Fotmer Biosciences in Uruguay. I think Tilray does an outstanding job, frankly, of being sort of patient first, medical first. And we can go to school on a lot of their experiences that they've had. And those organizations, I view them as friendlies. That's not saying we engage with them in any way, but I view their experiences as that they've encountered 10 years ago, 5 years ago in their respective countries. We're going through the growing pains that those organizations went through for being first movers in their own country. And so it feels lonely, but I know that the scene in the movie has been repeated elsewhere by these pioneers. It just hasn't been done in the US.
Do you think future federal legalization will provide the incentive for a truly global rollout of cannabis? And if not, why?
I think that the way cannabis goes federally in the United States will absolutely have downstream effects for the cannabis industry globally. Several reasons. One is that, like it or hate it, the US FDA is sort of the global gold standard for the way that drugs or pharmaceuticals or nutraceuticals are treated around the world. So the way that the FDA goes, the other health agencies go, because it's so important and so massive just because of our population, frankly. And so I think that the way the FDA decides to treat cannabis or CBD or THC or cannabis-derived drugs will implicate other health and narcotic agencies around the world. The other reason is simply for the efficiencies of business. Even if you're operating in a legal country, in a legal framework, if it's Canada or Israel or Germany or wherever, the pipes and the plumbing still run through New York City in the United States. So until the banking regulators in the US feel comfortable with cannabis's legality, there will always be frustrations or efficiencies to be had for countries around the world, irrespective of whether or not they're operating legally or illegally in their own country, because all the plumbing comes back to New York City for the financial institutions. And the other is just, I think, sort of an attitudinal tipping point. Like, the US has had this head in the sand approach to cannabis for so long that it's sort of the last bastion of prohibition, if you will. The day that the US becomes, as a country, okay with legal cannabis, I think that is a symbol to the rest of the world that we've exited the age of prohibition, and now sort of cannabis 2.0 or 3.0 or what have you is here, and it's here to stay.
Well, I think that wraps up a pretty tricky question very well. Thank you for joining us, George. We've very much enjoyed having you on.
It has been my absolute pleasure. Thank you both. Really enjoyed our discussion.
Where do they go? The smoke rings I blow each night.
Are you not entertained? Are you not entertained? Well, entertained or not, listeners, you must do as I command thee. Like, share, subscribe, spread the pod by any means necessary. We must have this out there. At my mark, unleash hell.
Love, please take me above. Take me with you.